two, one. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Inside Movies Galore. I'm one of your hosts, but today we are going to be continuing our theme of Audience Appreciation April, where we just recently went on about The Green Mile, which starred Tom Hanks. But from what I understand, Dane, this also stars Tom Hanks, correct?
It sure does, and it also stars Barry Pepper, who was in The Green Mile along with Tom Hanks. It's weird because in terms of the filmmaking, we're going back in time to the year prior to The Green Miles, because that was 99, this is 98. Film is Saving Private Ryan. Recommended to us by which group? Movie Collectors. I can't remember which group it was who recommended this film.
Movie Collectors did this one, yes.
Okay.
And so thank you to them for picking it. It's weird because, again, we're going the year prior in terms of the filmmaking, and yet we're going a couple years ahead in terms of the internal chronology of the film, because we were in 1935 in the Deep South with The Green Mile. Now we are in 1944 in the middle of Nazi-occupied France. Specifically, we begin with Omaha Beach there, so totally different locale, totally different period in history, totally different things at stake, totally different genre, etc. But nonetheless, another amazingly beautiful feather in Tom Hanks's illustrious filmmaking cap, and it stars him as well as a whole bunch of people that I didn't quite put two and two together until this most recent thing. But you got a surprising amount of stars in this, but they're not really treated like that. They're treated like the soldiers that they're playing. But you have Tom Hanks, Edward Burns, you got Matt Damon, which I knew about. Now, he wasn't as big of a star then as he is now, but he was becoming a big star. But Matt Damon, Tom Sizemore, Jeremy Davies, Vin Diesel, Adam Goldberg, Barry Pepper, Giovanni Ribisi, Ted Danson, Paul Giamatti, Nathan Fillion. And
as the other Private Ryan.
And someone that I totally forgot was even in this film, who was not at all a star yet, but would become a major star, was Bryan Cranston.
Yeah.
In a very
not to mention Harv Presnell in that same scene.
But again, they're the only one who you could argue is treated like a movie star just because he's the big name, is Tom Hanks. Everybody else, they're treated like the characters that they're playing. They're just they're soldiers. But anyway, plot wise, this film is about the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, specifically France, and specifically about Captain John H. Miller of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, who is on Omaha Beach during the Normandy invasion and is tasked with the peculiar quest, but one that is based on real life, peculiar quest of having to retrieve one of 4 brothers whose last name is Ryan. He has to retrieve the one brother, the one Ryan, who is still alive, because his 3 brothers were all deployed for active duty on the same day, and they were all killed in duty, in battle, and killed in action. And he is the last of his bloodline, basically, and so kind of through a bit of a happenstance of his story having been brought to the attention of the right people at the right time, to the attention of General George C. Marshall, he is ordered, Captain Miller's and his men are ordered to go looking for Private Ryan, played by Matt Damon, who was believed to have been misdropped in his paratrooper with the 101st Airborne Division. He's believed to have been kind of missed his drop zone, and so they have to go in and go get him and bring him home, because they don't want the Ryan bloodline to be evaporated from the earth because his other brothers are dead. It's one of those stories that you think, oh, that could never happen. That's way too sentimental, except it actually is based on a true story of the Nealand brothers, which, was a similar case of four brothers, that only one survived. And that was a script that was written by Robert Rodat and based on the historical writings of Stephen Ambrose, who was he a journalist, if I remember?
Ambrose is a war scholar and writer. He wrote the Killer Angel. No, that was Michael Chara. And I'm trying to remember what he wrote, but he wrote a lot of Civil War stuff.
Yeah,
And
historian.
I've read some of his stuff, and I find it astonishing that he thought the opening scenes were too graphic because some of his writing is graphic.
Yeah, but all of that to say that this film is very beloved. It made a shitload of money, which is rather unusual for a war film, and is for a film this violent. It's unusually violent for Steven Spielberg's filmography because it is a Spielberg film. But it got a lot of praise from really everybody for every department: acting, cinematography, the realism, the intensity, and also the reverence for the brave men who fought in World War II and specifically in the European theater. But also, I think more broadly, it's very reverent for the World War II generation, the greatest generation they were called. And this movie in particular, I think it really shows why they were called the greatest generation. They very selflessly sacrificed everything they had, including their lives in a lot of cases, to give us the world that we live in today. And none of us would be alive if it weren't for them. So we owe them everything. And this film is the ultimate tribute to what they sacrificed and what they did for all of us. So, I mean, it's something that we'll get into that as we go. But bottom line is it's kind of a big deal, is what I'm trying to say.
And yet it lost to Shakespeare in Love.
It did, which I love Shakespeare in Love. Also.
I love it too, but no.
Yeah. So it's, I don't want to. We'll get into that when we get into that. But Jake, do you want to start us off with your first impressions of this war epic?
Sure. This was one that came out when I was really kind of just really starting to get into movies, I really kind of hit the ground running in college when I fell in with a group of people who were hardcore movie nerds. But the year before that was the year that this and Shakespeare in Love and Thin Red Line and a couple other films were duking it out at the Oscars. And I do think that was the first year that I really watched the Oscars. And I had done a lot of reading into, the movies that year. And so I had heard a lot about this, and I was very curious about it. I know I didn't go see it in theaters, but I don't think it was too long before I saw it. It's not a film that I have ever had much desire to watch regularly. I mean, whereas The Green Mile, I kind of do really enjoy watching it. This one, I never really got much enjoyment. So this viewing was probably, I couldn't swear to it, but I would say maybe the third time I've seen it. Maybe the fourth, but probably the third. But it's the first time in several years. So I remembered a few bits of it. I remember that opening sequence, that kind of hellish opening sequence, because you can't forget that, really. I remember a few little bits and pieces to come after that, and I vaguely remembered some of the people who showed up. Like, I remembered Ted Danson was in there somewhere. I remembered it was pretty much Vin Diesel's entry into mainstream cinema. I remembered a couple things about that, but Yeah, overall, I was coming to it after a long period of time, so there was a little bit of freshness to this viewing. Um, it is a really good film. It is a slightly atypical Spielberg film. One could argue one of his last great films,
Hmm.
although he's had
Uh,
some really good ones since then.
yeah.
It's it's one of his less sentimental films, although there's still a lot of sentiment in it. And kind of like we talked about with Green Mile, there's a lot of great character actors in tiny parts, just giving it their all, and all the pieces working together. It's just a really, really well made film on most levels, pretty much every level. And yeah, it's a good, and there's a lot. I mean, again, we mentioned the Green Mile. There's a lot of commonalities. I don't know if we even mentioned that they're. I think we did that they're both bookended by a character looking back on the past.
Hmm.
In that one, of course, it was Paul Edgecombe. In this one, it's Ryan actually,
Yeah.
who's looking back on the past, and so that was it was interesting that these two got paired together. I thought it was a good
Yeah.
grouping.
Those are both pretty, these are both pretty monumental
Right.
films in their own right for a
Well,
lot of
again,
reasons.
numbers 26 and 27 on IMDb.
Yeah.
And
And,
this one won 5 Oscars, even though it lost
including,
one. Yeah.
well, including Best Director. And I
Hmm.
think honestly, this film belongs in a tragically sparing subcategory of Spielberg films where like this is more his 90s output where like he made his blockbusters with like Jurassic Park and The Lost
Hmm.
World, Jurassic Park, stuff
Hmm.
like that. But in the 90s, you really got the sense that he was trying to get outside of just the blockbusters, of which he did so well. But like,
Hmm.
you really got the sense that he was going for the next levels of filmmaking to where, like, with this film and with Schindler's List, yeah, he did the
Hmm.
World War II thing, but he was trying to go about it with a sense of kind of documentary type remove, in the sense that, like, you really got the sense that he was trying to treat this in a very grown up fashion and a very kind of
Hmm.
reverential, but also like it hits that right blend of reverence, but also some objective remove. So like you can tell with both films, he was looking even more at documentaries than he necessarily even was at fiction films for inspiration. Um,
Hmm.
and even though these coincide with real events and are based on real events very heavily, but you can even, especially in this film, you get more of the sense of like a documentary, even more than a fiction film. Um,
Hmm.
but he does that exceptionally well in this, and I just felt bad that I was like, he could have kept that momentum going for more movies in that same style. But then again, that's what makes this one and Schindler's List so special. What about David? What did you think of this film the first time you saw it?
Well, when it comes to war films, my dad has always been more of the history buff than I have. Um, and I guess because of my father, I've seen films like The Longest Day, which is one of those that I remember specifically for the fact that the dudes paratrooped into St. Mary Glees, and the paratrooper was caught on top of the fucking building. And I think in the very beginning moments, I think they said it was like the 4 minutes of this film. Um, is where you get a reality of what they had to deal with on the beach
Hmm.
on that day, and it's the horrifying elements of seeing your comrades in arms literally being blown to bits as you're coming off of these ducks.
Hmm.
I mean, they can't even make it to the beach. Most of them are just dropping into the water, and then once they finally get to the beach, you're caught up in that moment where you see all this blood and guts. This one guy's just holding his guts in his hand, and it's just one of those moments that to me just really cuts deep how in the moment, how in reality Steven Spielberg wanted us to feel. This was how it was on that day, and this it wasn't color coded. It was just bam, wham, bam. Thank you, ma'am. This guy's looking for his leg, and here you go. You know. And you got these character figures screaming in agony, and bullets are flying. I mean, there's a guy who gets his helmet like blown blown off or whatnot, and it's just reality kicks in. And except for much of the film, that's the moment that I remember the most, and I also remember how much of a craze that many many men who have worked in military and shit like that, men who have been there, seen it, and saw the beginning bits, and they were like, that was how it was, you know. So
that's what I've heard. Even if you were not of the World War II generation specifically, I think anybody that has seen battle, that they can relate to that to some degree, and that just shows what homework they really did on everything. What about Forrest? What did you think of Saving Private Ryan the first time you saw it?
Okay, so I didn't see it when it came out. I was only like 10 years. I was only 10 years old when it came out. But I remember a few years later, my cousin got it on DVD, and we watched it together. And the Battle of Normandy. I guess I'm gonna get this. Might as well get my favorite scene out of the way right now. That Battle of Normandy just stuck, immediately. It was just holy, at that point I was kind of getting, already watching violent horror movies, but this was just on a whole other level. It was like, holy shit.
This is real life.
Yeah, exactly. This is like, this is a much more, I guess real.
Not make believe.
It's much more realistic, a lot less fun, a lot more serious. That just stuck with me. That really, so that opening battle was just stuck with me. Just how visceral it was, and also plus it was just a very well directed scene or moment. Plus, and like you were saying, the cast. Like, I mean, at the time, Tom Hanks. I only knew Tom Hanks and Matt Damon because since Matt Damon was hot, hot and upcoming.
Right.
But this is my first time watching it in 20 years or almost 20 years, and just seeing how many names were like all those names you listed off. I was like, oh my god, I forgot all these guys were in this movie. Like Vin Diesel. When I was watching it the other day, I'm like, oh my god, it's Vin. I was like, Vin Diesel and Bryan Cranston were the two where I'm watching. I'm like, oh hey, it's Vin Diesel and Bryan Cranston. But yeah, I think I haven't watched too many I think really the only other World War II movies I've watched were a couple of Clint Eastwood movies, and also 1941, which is Steven Spielberg's first attempt at a World War II movie. But the less said about that, the better.
I have a copy that needs watching eventually, but I have not seen that.
Which one was it?
1941.
And wasn't Empire of the Sun also a World War II?
Which one are we talking? Empire of the Sun. Yeah. So that Empire of the Sun was another. That's one of my favorite Spielberg films. Now that was World War II, but it was from the perspective of the British occupied Chinese or Hong Kong,
right.
That whole because a lot of China was owned by the British at the time. Yeah, China gets invaded by the Japanese, who are going through their imperialistic phase again, and so a British boy gets separated from his parents and gets caught in the middle of all that. So that's in the Pacific theater, and then this is very explicitly in the European theater of the war. But that's why everybody, because it was World War II, everybody's experience of that is going to be different because there were two theaters. But what about Brandon? What did you think of this?
I just want to get one more word in. I'm definitely in that camp that thinks that this movie got robbed for Best Picture. Same with the Green Mile. Actually, even the Green Mile. I think 2 years in a row, Tom Hanks starred in movies that probably should have won that probably should have won Best Picture. That probably stood the test of time better than the movies that actually won Best Picture in those respective years.
I don't know, in '99, I would have pulled for Being John Malkovich.
Oh, definitely.
Love John Malkovich. Extra special shout out. Jeremy Davies was also Daniel Faraday in Lost. I always am reminded of, because he's another great character actor.
Another film that came out around that time that a lot of people were talking about, yet I found relatively boring, was The Thin Red Line.
Terrence Malick.
Yeah. A 6-hour movie that got pared down to like 3 hours, and kind of feels like it at points, but it is good. It's just Malick's an acquired taste.
Exactly.
What did you think of this movie?
So I first watched this movie. I don't remember, actually. That's the thing. I know I watched it probably by the time I hit college, because it came out around the time I was, I think it was late high school, early college when it came out. Was it 98?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was early college. I know I didn't see it in theaters, but I know when I saw it initially, it was quite the experience. That D-Day scene will sit with me for a while. I know I delayed it, my watching of it, because I thought the name, I don't know why, but the name just sounded stupid to me. And so it was like, eh, and I moved on to something else. Plus, Shakespeare in Love beat it, and I didn't care much for Shakespeare in Love either, well-crafted film. So I was like, well, if it's worse than Shakespeare in Love, I can't really be that good, can it? But films like that, when it comes to war films, I have a hit or miss relationship with them. They can be films like Battleground, where I felt like the film was dreadfully slow and boring. But this one wasn't too bad. It was kind of in between. It did have some pacing issues in the middle, where it's like, no matter how much I try, I can never, there's always a blank between that D-Day scene and that when they run into Ryan. For some reason, I blank out on that middle part, no matter how awake I am when I watch it. So it is what it is. But it's still quite a good movie, quite well done, and I think a worthy choice for our friends over at Movie Collectors. And watching it this time, I didn't feel much different than I did the last time I watched it. But one of these days, I need to watch it on a good big screen. I mean, I ended up watching this thing on an itty bitty, like I think 13-inch screen. So maybe it'll be better if I watch it on the bigger screen.
To quote David Lynch, you don't go watching movies on your fucking phone. Jake, did you give your thoughts? I can't remember.
What happened?
Did you give your thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you had. So I had seen this film once all the way through back when I was like, however old I was, like 14, 15, something like that. I saw it around the same age I saw Schindler's List. And, it was one of those ones I was like, I knew I needed to see it. It was important, covered an important event, all that stuff. And, I liked it at the time. I hadn't watched it for a long time since then. And I watched it for the first time all the way through in that many years this weekend. Went out and got the 4K Best Buy Steelbook for that purpose. And I did see it on the big screen, on a big screen and everything, with decent sound and everything. Now I'll say this: I think that everything that's praised about the film, Dave, if you can mute, everything that is praised about the movie is definitely worthy of it. With the Dave mute, if you everything that's praised about the film is definitely worthy of being praised. With the directing, the acting, the historical accuracy, the intensity, all that stuff. But I think what really struck me this time around was the fact that this film is really the ultimate tribute to the World War II generation, specifically known as the Greatest Generation. And every time I see this movie, I always think of both of my grandfathers who they served in World War II. One of them was the radar operator on a submarine, and then the other one had a near-death experience when he was flying a plane, I believe, in the Air Force, if I recall. So I always think about them every time I think of this film and of people of their generation. I think about the degree to which they sacrifice their time, their efforts, and in many cases their lives, so that all of us who are alive today could live in the kind of world that we live in now. We wouldn't have the world that we live in without them. And this movie really, that was really the intention behind the film, because Spielberg, his father served in the Pacific Theater, and he basically made this film for his father and for men of his generation. And it just made me think about how that generation of people, not just on the battlefield, but also on the home front, they sacrificed so much, and they were made of a lot tougher stuff than we're made of today, to where, we can't even be bothered to put a mask in front of our face to keep others from getting infected. And then they went off and, fought the great fight against the ultimate enemy. And they were just able to endure so much than we are today, and they did so selflessly and with honor in a way that we're severely lacking today. So I mean, that really stuck out to me, because I think it really does capture their spirit, the spirit of that generation. Now, again, it does kind of flow not so much like a traditional movie, and it flows more like a documentary, or like a lot of the Technicolor news footage, or the documentary footage that was captured during the war, of which there is a lot. A lot of that footage exists to this day. And so they had a lot of good reference material, and my dad would always watch anything Civil War related and anything World War II related. He would watch on the History Channel pretty obsessively. And so, I had some of that kind of spilled over into me. He was the big battle expert and everything. But like the idea being that, they had a lot of good reference material to go from in the visual category, on top of just the historical research that was done by everyone and their mother, pretty much, because of what a big deal World War II was. But specifically with filming, something that they did that was accurate to the way that news footage, that the documentary footage looked, was that Janusz Kaminski, who Steven Spielberg has used many times as a DP, took the protective coating off of the camera lenses and allowed for the light to come in and look more diffused, a bit softer, without being out of focus. He says it basically allowed for it to look closer to the way that those old documentary the old documentary footage looked, and it's shot that way. It's not shot like a movie in the classical sense, and the actors are not really treated like movie stars. They're treated like soldiers, and they're portrayed that way, and that really helps the feeling of the realism, and also just the way that the story flows. It's really not. It's not especially thematically rich in terms of, not like, say, with the Stephen King story that we analyzed, where we were able to dissect every single character and every theme, every this and that. This has a theme as far as like not allowing someone's legacy to be eradicated, and brotherhood and some of those typical war movie kind of themes. But I think also it's the idea of, well, not to jump too far ahead, but the ending line of "earn this, earn it," meaning earning the sacrifice, earn the what all they did to bring him home, and to be worthy of that gift of life. That's carried all throughout. But this does. I say all this because if we look at it through that kind of documentary style lens, then I think we'll be able to be in the right frame of mind for it, because this really was very well researched in terms of how the actual invasion of Normandy on Omaha Beach, how that all progressed. Like the way that it's shown there is more or less the way that it really did progress. As far as like when the film starts off, that's what most of that opening sequence is the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The American soldiers that they got off the boats there, they were facing heavy losses, heavy resistance, because the Germans had that very fortified position on the beaches with the guns that they have to just very carefully weave their way to gain some kind of ground to take out those guns that are mowing so many brave young men down. And that really does, more than anything, that goes a long way to show you just how much they sacrificed in terms of the lives lost, and how brutal warfare is. But also just like, then you think about the guys that we follow through most of the movie, and you're like, it just as easily could have been any of them that got mowed down before they even stepped off the boat. That's this thing that always, the whole sequence, obviously, as we all know, is pretty unforgettable. But it's to a certain degree that some people have actually gone back and said, "Oh, that was the best part. It topped itself right away, and then the rest of the movie couldn't hold up." I would say no. I think that it just takes it into the next logical step and all that. But in terms of like just pure visceral action and spectacle, and not spectacle, that's not the right word, but it affects your senses, in a way that the rest of the movie doesn't.
Well, there's
some. Go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say there's definitely a lot of sniper action.
Yeah, there's that. I was going to say as well, one thing I probably should have said when I was talking about my impressions, this was not a first impression so much as it was this time around. I had a minor, what do we want to say? Anyway, epiphany, I guess. Wow, someone's sprinkling something really loud. But anyway, the thing that I realized this time, a lot of times when you're watching war movies, you don't have any freaking clue what's going on. Like, war, almost by definition, is chaotic. Like, it's really hard to film war in a way that really makes it something the audience can really, really, really experience, partly because half the time you don't know what's going on. And I think one of the strengths of this one, and it kind of becomes apparent as that scene goes along, you have a few times where the camera drifts and looks at other things. But for the most part, it tightly follows Miller, Horvath, and a couple other characters as they move up the beach. And it keeps the focus pretty solidly on our group of characters.
You know what?
And what's that?
I was going to say, you know what it reminds me of that did this not long ago? 1917.
Yes.
There are a lot of parallels that 1917 took to this film.
But 1917 is a very good example of taking that almost to the extreme, where you literally are following these two guys without looking away, really. This was not as much of that, but I think y'all see what I'm saying, though. When you keep the focus on one group of people, it makes it much easier to really understand what the stakes are. Even though you're not looking at the whole battle, so in a way you're losing sight of the stakes, but it makes it more personal, which makes it more effective.
Well, so what's interesting, so you mentioned the chaos there. I mean, I think that's why we all remember the invasion of Normandy sequence so vividly, because and that's just something I often thought about, like if I were ever in that kind of situation of battle, like in the age of firearms. I mean, not so much in the age of and to a certain extent in the age of like swords and horses and stuff, you would experience the same degree of chaos. But like in the age of firearms, it's a whole other thing. As far as like you wouldn't know which end is up, and it's like this definitely puts you in that mindset, and it makes you ask, what would you do in that situation? And I think for me, what was so effective was you hear all the noise and the chaos and all that stuff, but then when it goes quiet because of the having temporarily lost one's hearing from being too close to an explosion, when it goes quiet, I think is when it's even more effective. And you have the unforgettable image of the guy picking up his own arm as he's dazed and trying to walk through this hellish battlefield. I mean, that whole thing is unforgettable for a reason, and apparently the way that they did it was more or less how the battle really progressed. That they sustained heavy losses during the initial. It was partially because they had enough guys to get them just far enough to get them, just inward onto the beach enough to finally take out the guns that were causing them so much trouble, and they were able to take him out and finally secure the beach. And a heavy loss of life, but a very, very, very important battle in the war, and it allowed for the rest of the Allied invasion of Europe to take place. And
the Allied forces were set up on that hill specifically so that they could stare down the enemies and fire off rounds as much as they could with those big ass iron things that were down on the beach to stop you with the barbed wire and shit. And seeing all those bullets fly and seeing those men not even make it off the freaking ducks.
Yeah.
Well, that's why it was such a fortuitous position for the Germans to have, and that's why we wanted it, because it was a pretty critical juncture to allowing the rest of our forces to get in, because at that point we were turning the tide of the war. And they really show that, but it was not without heavy loss of life. And now that's not as visceral as that sequence is. It's by no means the only visceral battle sequence. They have several kind of throughout the movie. You have plenty of sniper action. You have plenty of experiences with like the Tiger tanks and that kind of stuff, which we'll get to later. But that's the one that people remember. I think partially because it is so intense, but it's such that it does leave an impression. It does hammer home the points of the film, which is that it's a little cliche to say, but war is indeed hell, and and it just shows that again, that was a generation that they answered their country's call. And they gave their lives so that all of us today could be talking to each other and could be alive. So, I mean, that always fills me with a lot of reverence. But that's where one of those guys who dies is laying face down. It says Ryan S. because it's one of the Ryans who died during that day. And James Francis Ryan with the 101st Airborne Division. He's somewhere in Normandy, having gotten missed. They missed their drop point or whatever, and so that's when, after having had it brought to his attention, General George C. Marshall authorizes for James Francis Ryan to be brought home so that he will not be the only Ryan left
Not to
in
mention
there.
that scene right before with them looking at them dog tags and poking fun at the stuff, and all these soldiers are like in the background.
Oh, that was much later.
That's much later. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. So he reads out the Abraham Lincoln Bigsby letter, which is one of many letters that someone would write to a fallen soldier. And that difference there is that it was written by Abraham Lincoln as opposed to some of those more stock letters that were written for the other mothers of dead soldiers and that kind of stuff. And so, idea being that he will not be the only Ryan that's left. And so that's when our dear Captain Miller, played by Tom Hanks, who is not very open about his past or anything. He is just a soldier. He goes and does his job, and that's how he wants to be seen and remembered. But he gets given that mission to go get Private Ryan, and so they have to get some of the few people that are left after the bloody invasion. And that's when they get the seven guys together to go into the heart of France to go and look for James Francis Ryan. And, they have a bit of a false alarm there with James Frederick Ryan, played by Nathan Fillion, which that's a little bit of humor there, which is good. There's some humor in the film, but it's very sparse and it doesn't.
It's some humor, but you feel for that guy. It's like,
yeah. Well, what made him sad is he thought that his brothers were killed, and his brothers were all in grade school, which is just kind of funny that he could think that they were all dead somehow.
Well, actually think about it, the time that they're living in, because we really are still in. Just working our way out of the Great Depression.
Right.
The resources are limited, and there was a lot of death. If you weren't rich in the United States during the 30s and 40s, death was a common.
Yeah, it could have been polio, and nowadays it would be a school shooting.
Well, even this kid might have been old enough to remember the Spanish flu outbreak. I don't know that he would have necessarily, but I'm sure his family remembered it vividly.
Oh, his parents definitely.
Yeah.
I was gonna say like that, or Spanish flu, coronavirus now. It's all that stuff. And so basically, they go out there to go look for him, and they come across different. Different divisions along the way. They have a particularly tense encounter with a German sniper in these bombed out ruins of a town. And, that's a particularly good sequence there because you have sniper versus sniper. That's the Barry Pepper role. He's one of the more memorable.
Well, even before that, we get our big moment for Vin Diesel, where you have a family in the ruins who are desperate they see soldiers and they're like, oh, they can get us to safety, and they like practically force their daughter into Diesel's arms, and he wants to help, and Hanks is like, no children, we can't take kids, we can't take them. And then, in the process of trying to save her, he gets shot down. Diesel gets shot down. And, and then when it's finally over, Miller's just like, that's why we don't take kids. And it's like,
and then my favorite little cap off to that whole thing is that what is the kid in question? What does she do? She smacks her dad around. And she's like, why did you do that to me?
Right.
And, I could totally feel for her because she doesn't want to be separated from her parents.
And she'll be scarred for life.
Oh, I know. If she lives. Because we don't see them after that. But, that's, and there's a lot of doubts that spread throughout the group all along the way because of the fact that this mission, quite frankly, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it doesn't really make sense to any of them, including Captain Miller. And I think that's one of my favorite things about it, because I think if they didn't have that as a pretty critical storytelling element, then all of us would be left to question, yeah, what's so special about this Ryan guy? And quite frankly, there really isn't, other than the fact that his brothers got killed all on the same day, and he just happened to have his story told to the right people. But it's not so much about that. It's about these guys doing their duty and following orders. And also, once we actually do find Private Ryan, just the fact that because he was chosen, that he needs to really earn, live a life that's worthy of that great gift of having been able to go home. But all along the way, they have like various encounters there. They have the encounter with like the scene David mentioned of like they look through dog tags, and they have to kind of stop doing that because everybody, the other soldiers that are in pretty bad shape, they are checking out what they're doing, and it doesn't really look good, and it kind of will demoralize them even more. They eventually have that encounter with the one German who tries to establish a rapport with them by referencing Steamboat Willie and that kind of stuff.
yeah.
And it's not working out. That was a derelict radar station, I believe. So that's where they have like that major turning point where, Captain Miller's like, I really don't give a damn about Private Ryan. I just want to do my duty so that we can all, have a chance to go home, because but also he acknowledges some bits about his past that he's not been open about prior to then, which is like that he is a school teacher in where was it, Pennsylvania, and he the longer he's there and the more inroads he makes into occupied France, the further from home he feels. So he's like, we got to do this so we can all have a chance to get home.
And
I do.
I feel like the captain does develop some throughout the story, whereas he is very much a by the book character. I mean, he's just basically, we follow orders, don't really question the orders. It doesn't matter what I think, we're following orders. I think he even says earlier on, well, if it were me, I would just say, well, I'm going to follow the orders that I was given. Towards later on, even where he actually makes a decision after they find Ryan, which is a decision that he would never have come to at the beginning of the movie. But because of the character character growth that he got to at the end of the movie, he was actually able to make that decision. So I thought that was pretty good.
And again, this is definitely a movie that's full of a lot of specific incidents and little vignettes here and there, largely because real life doesn't really follow like a perfectly structured plot. It's more so just like this happened and this happened and this happened, and it kind of, but the way it flows, it's like you see how these different characters, how they react to these situations, and how they really don't want to keep going, and yet they have to because it's their orders, but also because Captain Miller is able to lay it down very honestly to say that this is what they got to do, but he also offers up more of himself than he was willing to for a lot of the movie. And they do eventually find James Francis Ryan, and they relay the news to him. But I think something that really makes him stand out and because he tells towards the end, Captain Miller tells him to earn this, which is pretty profound. But one thing I'll say with James Francis Ryan as a character, he's already got the right stuff when we first meet him, because upon hearing the news of his brother's death, all three of them, their deaths, he is obviously grief-stricken by it, but he doesn't break down in the way that Nathan Fillion, James Frederick Ryan, did when he thought his brothers were dead. He's grief-stricken, but it's not at the expense of his duty, because he is not willing to leave his compatriots because they have to protect that bridge. It's a strategic location to it's a key bridge that is going to be involved in a German attack. They doesn't want to abandon his post, even at the expense of his being able to go home. I think that says a lot about him as a character, that he is not willing to abandon his post. It's not that he's being obstinate, it's that he has a greater sense of duty beyond his own safety. And that already tells us, the audience, that he is indeed a worthy person to have gone to save. That he was not just like, if it had been some spoiled asshole or something, then he'd be like, we risked our men and our lot, we risked our time, our men, our resources, our everything for this guy. But he really proves himself to actually be worthy of all that effort, and such that they make use of the additional personnel, the additional ammunition and strategy and all that stuff, and they decide they're going to help James Francis Ryan to defend this key post. And so they devise an ambush where the German is the elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division with 2 Tiger tanks and 2 Marder tank destroyers and infantry. They all come in, and the idea with Steven Spielberg there is he kind of feared that people would see just the invasion of Normandy sequence, and then they'd be so exhausted and so appalled by the violence that they might go the first weekend and then not want to go again, or they may not, they would be okay the first weekend and then people wouldn't want to see it after that point, or they would be so turned off by it or whatever.
Well,
or that they would have said, oh, that was the best part and then everything else was boring. So what he did try to do was try to frame it, try to bookend it with 2 pretty big set pieces. And so, it's not quite the same thing, but that whole attempt to protect that bridge from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, that was a pretty good sequence there.
Yeah.
and war is hell, as
It
it's
is.
always been
Yes.
said. And one of the things, and I think that World War One was an interesting concept, and World War Two, of course, World War Two was something that we really could not imagine at the time that even it occurred, because World War One left such a distinct mark upon our society. The horrors of war really, so the horrors of war have always been there. War had almost always been glorified and sung in songs of glory and greatness up until then. And then, of course, World War One. There was a reason why they call it the war to end all wars, even though it obviously was not. So World War Two was just another one. I thought World War Two was always considered in between. There was a mythic nature to World War Two that kind of echoed the wars of old, but there was still a horrifying element of it
Yeah.
that kind of echoed World War One. Not as horrifying as World War One was, but not as glorified as the other wars of old, like the Crimean War or
Well,
stuff
you
like
are
that.
right. You are right. Now, I mean, there have been plenty of bloody wars in history. I mean, like the 100 Years' War in England.
Oh,
You
yeah.
had the American Civil War, the American Revolutionary War, for that matter. But you're right that we always did have this tendency to mythologize different aspects of it. And in a lot of ways, for good reason, especially like World War II, like there was a real sense that that there was something to fight for and a clear enemy to fight against and that kind of stuff. And but you're right, it's the World War One aspect. Like World War One, that was a scale on which people they weren't really ready for a war of that scale. That really was a world war. Now there were wars that involved a ton of disparate countries from all over the world, but it wasn't on that level. And World War One was a weird time because that was when you had these brand spanking new inventions of like the balloon and some early airplanes and that kind of stuff. You had that merge with like trench warfare and that kind of stuff, chemical warfare, all these things that were new, but also people didn't really know just how destructive those things were. And
Mhm.
Then World War II comes along, or even before that, Germany felt defeated and they felt like they were being bled dry, by having to pay back a lot of, the parts of Europe that they had destroyed in World War One. And then, that's of course perfect time for fascism to arise and for, make Germany great again, ostensibly. And, then that, leads to all that tyranny and the Holocaust, etc. And I think World War II has definitely become mythologized because of just how clear of an enemy Hitler was, and how bad imperialistic Japan was, and Mussolini's Italy, and that kind of stuff. And of course, the setting the stage for Stalin's Russia to be a threat, and that kind of stuff.
Well, it is kind of a scary thing when you think about it, because in these days, when people try to say, Nazis are actually good guys and people who are
Hmm.
against fascism are evil, it is more and more scary as you go forward in society. But
Well, it's
war
more
itself.
so like people do emphasize different, or they either emphasize or de-emphasize different aspects of the whole story, and it is very complex. But you are right that the elements of fascism have tragically persisted to this day in a way that is you would have thought would have been unthinkable. Um, but I mean, that's also what gives me a lot of pause whenever I think of this film and films like it. But none greater than this, just because you had whole generations of people that could clearly see. Yeah, granted, not right away because we were still isolationist up until Pearl Harbor. But once Pearl Harbor happened, it's like there was no going back, and we
Well,
jumped in.
I think it was somewhat like right after the Nuremberg trials that America decided that we have to be part of this war.
Well, no, the
Oh,
Nuremberg trials were
well, that was
after.
Yeah,
after the
that
war,
was
but yeah.
long after.
But
Yeah.
actually,
But
there is a point.
the point being that you see a generation of people who would have grown up at a time when America was pretty staunchly isolationist, and we only kind of got drug into World War One kind of begrudgingly, and we weren't really intent on going back into that whole arena. And then the fight got brought to our shores, and it took us by such surprise that we decided we cannot sit on the sidelines anymore. And despite, and we could have gotten involved a lot sooner because people knew that the Holocaust was starting to happen and that kind of stuff. But like, this really is a portrait of people that, that being said, they were able to see an enemy that was so clearly destructive to everything good in this world, and they were able to, go and be selfless and be able to go and do what they needed to do. And I think about if we had the people that exist now who are really social media obsessed and won't wear a mask and don't think that important things are a big deal, and they put their priorities in all the wrong places. Imagine them on the battlefield. It's like, would they A, know what to do, and B, would they have their priorities in the right place? Absolutely not. So, you know, this definitely shows that character of the greatest generation that I think we could learn a lot from, because it was a generational characteristic that they were steadfast and they put up with a lot of hardships in a way that I don't
There
know
was
if
definitely a
necessarily.
different mindset
Yeah.
in this time
Now,
and age.
Well, now,
now I
granted,
will say
it wasn't Shangri-La, because I mean, a lot of
I
black soldiers that fought, they were fighting for a country where they were not wholly equal, and
no,
this is pre-civil rights and everything.
now I will say something, and I want to actually. I guess my wife couldn't be with us on the previous video, she can sort of live on because we've had this discussion before. Um, and this is one misconception about the United States that I do like to make sure of during World War II before we entered the war. We were not entirely isolationist. We were partially so.
Yeah.
And in saying so, because prior to our entry in the war, we were very selective in who we dealt with. We were
Mhm.
selling weapons to the Allies, and we were not selling weapons
Right.
to the Axis. Matter of fact, Pearl Harbor itself was due to the fact that the Japanese had become very reliant on trade with us, and we were just
Mhm.
like, "Heck no, we ain't trading with y'all. Y'all are invading China," and
Yeah.
and they were like, "Okay, well, we'll force their hand." So that was part of the Pearl
Pearl
Harbor
Harbor.
aspect. So again, it's kind of a cool thing how it worked from that. Then Pearl Harbor became that rallying cry, and I really do think that we wouldn't even have entered in the European theater had had Germany not decided, hey, we're going to declare war on the
Mhm.
United States as well, which also reflected back on World War One, where Germany never really quite forgave us for entering
Well,
the war.
you know the story that I'm still waiting to get told on the big screen is the fact that our great American industrialist Henry Ford was a massive Nazi sympathizer and actually helped
Oh,
to
we had so
provide
many.
on. Well, we had a lot of Nazi sympathizers in this
Well,
country, and you
if
know,
Well,
if
and
we ever
there,
cover The Great Dictator, that's a good example of a
well,
film where people here and people in higher areas of
right.
government
yeah,
were
they
afraid to
said.
have it because they did not want Hitler depicted in a negative way.
Well, they said to Charlie
Right.
Chaplin, "Don't do this. Don't get involved." And that was 1 year before Pearl Harbor. And then, of course, Pearl
Right.
Harbor hits, and then lampooning Hitler was the thing. Yeah, everybody did that. After that
Well,
point.
and actually, there's a very interesting couple of conversations in this year's Oscar race. Of course, one of the big film nominations wise is Mank. They have a couple of conversations on that very subject of, like, oh, well, this is starting to happen in Europe, and oh, well, this doesn't bother us at all, and all that sort of thing. And it was an interesting conversation they had.
Yeah, which now it is a misconception to say that everybody, like, as I do say that the greatest generation, that they did have a mindset that we could learn from, and I stand by that. But I will say that much like any period in history, there were people that were that they either sympathized with Hitler, or they didn't think that he was a big deal initially, or they thought, oh, he's just a blowhard, he'll go away, or he'll like a Neville Chamberlain, he'll listen to reason, etc.
Hmm.
You had plenty of shades of gray there, because if it was that black and white, then they would have seen the evil that he was, long before. It wasn't that way, but eventually it became to where it was too obvious for even them to ignore,
And to
and
extreme.
yeah, exactly. And but point being that that's it. It's important to remember that people didn't get involved partially because they didn't want to, partially because they thought, oh, he'll calm down, or they really did sympathize with him and his goals. But um, anyway, so with this film, we do have that kind of climactic defending of the bridge, which does not go especially well, but then they're saved at the last minute by American P-51 Mustangs that are tank busters, and that's where, because Captain Miller had gotten shot, and that's where he tells Private Ryan, "Earn this,"
Hmm.
meaning the chance that he got to live, earn this, earn it. He dies, and because the film opens and closes with an old man, Private Ryan, him at the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, with
A
all of this.
similarity to the first movie.
Yeah,
Yep. Yep.
exactly. But he's there looking at the grave of Captain Miller, and he's basically pleading with him, his gravesite, pleading with him, basically saying, was I worthy? Did I live a good life? Was I worthy of that sacrifice?" And I can only imagine the weight of what's all on his shoulders, knowing that just the men in that little troop versus all the men who could have been there instead of him. And he kind of has a bit of survivor's guilt, but again, that all of this we kind of breeze through the plot largely because it is just kind of a series of incidents there. But it's more. This is one of those ones that, like you say, you sum it up on paper, and it really does not do justice to it. This is a movie that should be seen and felt, and it's very visceral, and it should be experienced because that's really what it's meant to do. And but I think that just it really is the ultimate tribute to that generation and also anybody that serves in the armed forces. It's like they are putting themselves literally in the line of fire, and they're doing things that allow the rest of us to live and agree with or disagree with a particular armed conflict of whatever time period you're in, whatever war, criticize the leaders, criticize the strategy, etc. But the actual boys, the men and women, but mostly men historically, and even today, the people that shoulder that great burden. I mean, we owe them everything, and just the way that we don't give them the praise that they deserve, and especially if and when they come back, just the way that they're treated, that's a whole other discussion. But it's just again, this, I think anybody of any war can really see that it was a filmmaker's thank you to people that are able to and willing to put their lives on the line like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think it's a movie that really accomplishes what it sets out to do, and it's a film that it does not fall into the trap of other war movies, especially from like a certain era, that it does not fall into the Jinjoistic trap, of like, oh, American exceptionalism or this and that. Now it's very reverential, that's for sure.
And I know he wasn't trying to be like Apocalypse Now at all.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
That's a different war film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, it's funny because this, I think, is a great film for its specific war. And I think Apocalypse Now, of course, Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece. I think that's the perfect war for perfect film for its war, which is Vietnam. And because that film is much more overtly critical of war itself, and also of why they're fighting, how they're fighting, the psychedelic nature of it all, the insanity, the this, that, and the other thing. It definitely encapsulates that feeling of it all in its own right. And that one's much more just critical of not just the war effort, but also of just the human heart in general. So it's a different aspect of things. I think just as powerful in its own right. This one its intentions are different, and I think it definitely it accomplishes what it sets out to do, but it avoids a lot of the Jinjoistic attitudes of older war films, while also at the same time being reverential to those who serve. And I think it hits that balance just right.
One thing that annoyed me about this film before we get into production at all, and I think we've touched on production overall, but the private or soldier that couldn't quite kill the German.
Oh yeah.
So
Right.
Darn annoying, because he was to me he was citing the rules and shit like that, and, up and down, and then in the next moment he was not following a fucking thing.
Yeah,
So,
well, he's like, as I felt the same way. I was like, shoot the fucking guy, you idiot.
right.
But I also think his character, his again, Jeremy Davies, highly underrated actor. He represents a side of soldiering that is not flattering, but it can happen, which is the coward, the one who doesn't do his duty. I mean, that's kind of what the Red Badge of Courage, that's what it's about. Different war, of course, but like that, he's the main character there. He starts off as a coward, and then he eventually becomes brave and does his duty, and does so with valor. And kind of similar here, except that he's more of a coward through most of the movie, and then he only kind of sort of does what he should do at the end. But I do think he represents that side of soldiering that I think there are plenty of people who would choke under the pressure. If you showed them all as just purely heroic, that wouldn't be realistic either.
It's also interesting that his cowardice puts him in a prime position, basically when everyone is ready to like when they finally turn the tables and they're finally winning, if you will. He's right there, and all he has to do pretty much is stand up and say, yep, listen to them.
Yeah.
But it's like he actually helps resolve the situation faster because they had not deemed him a threat, and he was able to basically stay right there.
Yeah,
So
he much like Oscar Schindler in Schindler's List, who Oscar Schindler admittedly did a whole lot more than this guy did, but they ultimately arrive to the same place, which is I could have done more. And this guy really could have done a lot more because he was the ammo guy. He was supposed to be Johnny on the spot, as Adam Goldberg said. And he could have done a lot more. He could have killed the one German guy before he killed Adam Goldberg. But I think it's just interesting to point that out because I do think with both of those films that you do see a little bit of survivor's guilt there, but you also just get the sense that every single person's actions or inactions, that they all matter. And granted, in Oscar Schindler's case, he actively, schmoozes with the Nazis as a war profiteer for a good while, and then his change is gradual, but it's there, and then when he's able to turn himself around, he does make a lot more outstanding changes and is able to save thousands of lives. But again, he could have done more, and he realizes that. In this case, it's just like a smaller scale version of that same theme, but that's a very Spielbergian theme that every single person's life matters, and it's what you do with it or don't do with it that really counts. But I mean, production-wise, we touched on a bit of how it was filmed. I think the realism really definitely carries a lot of weight in this film. It makes the film really. The fact that they took a lot of influence from the real footage of the real war as it happened, that helped a lot. One little bit of trivia, actually 2 bits of trivia. One, especially, the film was largely shot in sequence, especially with the battle scenes. And it made it apparently very hard for Spielberg to kind of know about what his shooting schedule was going to be, kind of about where he was in the process. Because he was like, I don't know, I haven't yet. I've only made it a little bit onto the beach, to progress. So he's like, I don't know what I'm going to be done. I need to advance, And so it's like he was having to basically fight the war, and while making the movie, try to do it in that order, get a little bit further ahead. And then apparently, and I mentioned the documentary stuff before, which is true, but apparently Spielberg really took a lot of influence in how he shot the invasion of Normandy. He took a lot of influence from the invasion of Burleson Air Force Base in Dr. Strangelove, because he was such a huge fan of Kubrick's, even before becoming friends with Kubrick, because he said, because he had visited Kubrick while he was shooting Eyes Wide Shut, because he was shooting Saving Private Ryan. He visited him, and he was saying that he got inspired by Burleson Air Force Base, that whole sequence. And Stanley was like, "Oh, great," and then he changed the subject because he was he was uncomfortable with receiving compliments, apparently. But I thought that was interesting. But production-wise, this really does. it feels about as close to a documentary as a fiction film can. I think like it really does not feel movie-ish at all in the best possible sense. And the actors, they feel like you see the characters before you see the actors, even though the actors they pick very distinct actors so you remember their faces, which is a very wise decision. And this did have a John Williams score, and it had the very haunting theme called Hymn to the Fallen, which definitely accomplishes what it sets out to do. It is indeed a hymn to the fallen.
Oh yeah.
Again, the music only comes in at certain key moments, like it's not really throughout in the way that one might expect.
No, because there were definitely some silent moments that definitely were filmatic in its sequences.
Yeah, well, the moments without music, I think, are the ones that really work the best, because they feel, they put you right there in the moment. Did we have any particularly favorite scenes outside of the invasion of Normandy, which we've already acknowledged is kind of the most spectacular scene in the film?
I mean, for me, I would say when they're blowing up at the end, when they're blowing up the bridge.
Right.
I would have to say every time Sniper Jackson was saying what he was saying before he went and took a snipe at someone. I don't know why, but those words that he was saying were just kind of cool.
Yeah,
when he was snipe hunting.
He was very religious, and so he was asking God to guide his hand, and then he gave a gift to do this and to protect his fellow men and that kind of stuff.
Right.
He gave him some personality.
And of course, he did have a really great moment that supposedly was based on an actual event, and that was the one where he managed to snipe another sniper right through his sight.
That's
which
right.
Apparently, I think that was like a sniper in Vietnam managed to pull that off or something. That's definitely no mean feat.
Well, and that was
thinking about the
kind of a thematic carryover to a much later war. But you remember in American Sniper with Chris Kyle having made that like impossibly long shot, which I think in real life he really did make. Not the butcher as a character, I don't think existed, but like he was kind of a composite of different targets that he took out. But like that insanely long shot that he should not have made, he did make in real life, if I remember correctly.
I keep thinking about the sniper in the in Inglourious Bastards.
Yeah, I remember him. He was the one that later becomes the subject of Nation's Pride.
Yeah, because he's using a movie like to think, oh, they're making a movie about him. It's a propaganda movie.
Daniel Bruhl's character. Yeah,
he was a sniper for the Nazis, but
yeah.
Well, and then of course there's the sniper and Enemy at the Gate. So,
yes,
but I did want to mention that Robot Chicken actually spoofed Saving Private Ryan in an episode called Saving Private Giggly. It opened in season 5 with them on the beaches of Normandy.
Well, and we're also forgetting about the famous porn parody Shaving Ryan's Privates, which is, that a title like that was just begging to be parodied even before people saw the movie. So let's see, Forrest said the bridge, Dave, you said the sniper stuff, Brandon?
I don't know, really. I mean, other than the D-Day sequence, I would guess some of the sequences, the sequence at the end where they have the older version of him kind of breaking down a little bit, saying he never hoped to come back here. And there is something about that, because when you think about it, of course, there's no way that most soldiers that saw combat, unless they were kind of sociopathic, didn't have at least a little PTSD on returning.
At least a little.
So it's just kind of an interesting scene and cutback, and you can feel more of the emotion
Mhm.
at the end, understanding where it was, what had happened, and why he was
Mhm.
upset. Not that it was hard to determine anyway, but
Hmm. I think
Indeed.
I think I would probably pick that scene that you mentioned, but specifically the line where he was like, basically asking if he lived a good life, if he was worthy of it all. Because I think that I think personally, I would make the case that yes, he was, because he had already exhibited the kind of characteristics of a good soldier and a good loyal person, to where even if he didn't get saved, then he was worthy. But he, being the survivor, he's not going to think that. He's just going to think that other people deserve to be there instead of him. But it's like I love endings like that. They sort of had that bittersweetness to them, and to where the main character is not really completely satisfied with how they ended up, because they feel like they could have done more, or been more, or this or that. Same with Schindler's List, same kind of thing. But that really struck a chord with me. What about you, Jake?
Uh, hmm. I don't really know what I would say is my favorites. This one's a little harder to assign favorites to. I mean, that opening sequence is not my favorite, but it's certainly one of the most memorable.
Oh,
um,
well,
there
actually,
were-
super quick. Talk about effects. The
Mhm,
actual gore effects, which again, not
mhm.
for horror purposes, but they are
Right.
horrific. And yeah, and like I'm thinking of the scene where
Mhm.
Captain Miller's like asking for backup or
Yeah.
reinforcements. Leans over, talks to the other guy, leans back. The guy's face is blown off.
Yeah.
Completely, and it's done pretty seamlessly.
Yeah.
Uh, but anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So on that lovely note, uh, I I do think like yeah, part of me kind of likes the scene where they have the wrong Ryan. I mean, I shouldn't, but for some reason, especially knowing it's Nathan Fillion, um, but I feel for the guy. But I have to admit, in the end, probably the bridge sequence and a couple of those scenes like Dave was talking about with the sniper, with like his
Mhm.
pre what do you want to say? What's the word I'm looking for?
His almost Boondock Saints chant.
Well, he's
Yeah, no,
praying while he's doing it.
rituals. That's the word I'm looking for. His rituals. Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to say really quick before we end here with our outros is when Giovanni, his
Mm-hmm.
character as a medic, dies,
Right.
and he's like screaming for his mom. That part really gets me too.
Right.
When he's screaming for his mommy after they shoot him full of morphine twice.
Mm-hmm.
They came in those little pinprick things and shot him in his legs, and his guts were spilling out, and it was just kind of heartbreaking and heart wrenching, especially since he was the one who noticed all the soldiers passing with them dog tags before that. So,
Mm-hmm.
but other than that, why don't we start with our outros?
Well, the just before we do that, because we all remember the Normandy sequence. So the idea was, according to Spielberg, he wanted to include this particularly violent sequence, which is like 20 minutes plus, in order to bring the audience onto the stage with me, specifically noting that he did not want the audience to be spectators, but rather he wanted to demand them to be participants with those kids who had never seen combat before in real life and get to the top of Omaha Beach together. And I think that's why we remember it so much, because we are not spectators, we're participants in it. And I think the best directors especially when they're dealing with violent material that is of a realistic nature and is not make believe. They know that the best way to do it is to bring people up onto the stage and they're part of it. They're not just watching it. They are, they feel like they are there in the moment. And I think he did that remarkably effectively. And that's why we're talking about the film today and why it leaves an effect on us. Plus, again, the sacrifice of that greatest generation. So it is the ultimate tribute to them. So yeah, outros.
Alrighty. Who wants to start?
Well, I'm Dan Kyle, filmmaker, regular crew member of Inside Movies Galore. I have do unboxings on the Indie Horror Film Creative channel under the show Blu-ray Views, and then also I've done some commentary tracks on No Money Film School, which I still need to revamp now that I've more or less gotten life under control. But yeah, I'm always up for these kinds of discussions about meaningful movies and things, and this is a particularly good one.
Okay. Why don't we go with you, Forrest? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
All right, I'm Forrest Bennett. I'm an independent film producer in Long Island, New York. Also appearing on. Also have my own YouTube channel, Forrest B. Bennett. I'm on a couple of YouTube channels right now. Under the Radar, where I will be doing commentaries on other Tom. Or actually, this month I'll be talking about other Tom Hanks movies, Joe versus the Volcano, and The Burbs. So here I'm covering serious Hanks, and over there I'm covering comedic Hanks. And then also on a channel called Evil Greg, where every week we do dramatic table readings of unproduced scripts. Right now we're doing Justice League Mortal.
That's a cool idea.
Okay. Moving on over to Brandon. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, I'm Septum Sen versus the world. We love our physical media. Of course, we've been chugging along, doing our pickups and new releases. Of course, with a lot of these vaccines coming out, eventually we're going to actually start getting back to normal. Probably within the next month, probably by May, I'd expect us to actually be filming in the same room. Oh, that's I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
And I'll be in the Richmond area this June. Maybe we can join you guys. So.
Hey, that'd be kind of cool. Bring a few pickups. Maybe we could do like a pickup video together. That'd be kind of
definitely.
Cool. So some exciting things, and we have decided. Of course, Oscar coverage is our main focus this time. Well, not really this time of year, but because the Oscars are in April this time of year, for crazy time, we are actually doing a lot of coverage for that. So that's going to be cool, and we are going to do our own awards show, which we are very happy about. Check out our discussion about that, and more to come as we go. So I think it's going to be spectacular. When we get to the event, I think it's going to be an amazing thing. So you guys stay tuned. But I do work with Inside Movies Galore, and we have an excellent month continuing with our Viewer Appreciation Month. And next week, we're missing Mo, but his group, Mo's Tavern, is not going to be missing next week as we cover Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze, as we give it its own episode. We kind of like touched on it when we did the original Turtles episode.
Yeah.
And but we're going to give it its own episode for this.
Woo!
And then we're going to follow it up with a classic sci-fi horror film, Alien.
Two of my all-time favorites.
Awesome. Going over to you, Jake. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, my name's Jake. I'm also here in Central Virginia and also co-host on Symptom Sim versus the World. And, as he said, we're, big time collector, movies, music, all sorts of media. Looking forward to our Oscar discussions and other upcoming discussions. You mentioned next week's the week after we're going to be looking at some stuff from Animazing Collections, and looking forward to that. And it's going to be good times. And then, of course, I'm looking forward to the cast month. It's going to be good times as well. And then, in the meantime, just have enjoyed this Audience Appreciation Month. It's nice getting to hit some of the, we're hitting some of the big ones, but it's on request, so it feels good, right?
Yeah, definitely.
There you go.
And my name is David Strege. I'm one of the founding fathers of Inside Movies Galore. So thank you for joining us, if you have, on our discussion here. Hopefully we haven't been too long in the tooth on either one of these two films. But definitely join us for next week's endeavors. But I also moonlight under a different channel called Delusions of Grandeur, where I go on about my own thoughts and feelings on films, sharing what kinds of films are out there that are unique and odd and probably not really talked about. But I also do video pickups on the same channel and other film discussions with some of these guys. So definitely like, share, and subscribe. And hopefully you are not shaving your privates anytime soon. But thank you for listening. Have a great day, evening, or morning, wherever you are. Thanks for watching. Enjoy.